Professor Meir Loewenberg is a Professor Emeritus of the Bar-Ilan University School of Social Work. He received his academic degrees from Harvard, Columbia, and Wayne State. He came on Aliyah to Israel together with his family in 1971 and now lives in Efrat. Since his retirement 30 years ago, his research interests have focused on the history of the Temple Mountain and the Western Wall. His recent publications have appeared in Akira. Is it?
Akira.
Yeah. Akira, Middle East Quarterly, Skula, and other publications. Professor Loewenberg,
thank you, Chaim.
the floor is yours.
Two preliminary comments. One, I'm sorry this lecture comes after the one we just heard before. I'm going to talk about 1921, which is a few years before 1936, but there's a connection between the two, so you got to keep this in mind. Two, the fact that I don't have any slides is another piece of evidence that I come from a previous generation. When I was active in academia last, we didn't have slides, we didn't have any of these things. Okay. Tomorrow is June the 3rd, the 100th anniversary of the Winston Churchill White Paper of 1922. Bull. We heard in the last 2 days all kinds of things that the White Paper did. Pro, negative. One thing it did not talk about at all, and I think the absence is significant, it did not talk about the Temple Mount, which today we know is one of the key issues in the problems that we have in this area. It isn't there. And there's a good reason why the White Paper did not talk about it. To understand this, we have to go back 300 years before 1921, more than 300 years. When the Ottoman Empire captured the area that we now know as Palestine, it continued to enforce a strict ban on non-Muslims entering the compound of the Temple Mount. True, now and then a Christian or a Jew either blundered his way up there or on purpose went up there. If they get caught, most of them didn't get caught. Some of them talked about it, some did not. But the ban was complete until mid-19th century. What happened in the middle of the 19th century? We know that the Ottoman Empire got weaker and weaker. It depended more and more on support from other forces. Mid-19th century, there was a conflict between France and Russia about who would take over the patronage of Christian sites in the Holy Land. And at one point, the French persuaded the Sultan to issue an order that the French would now be the patrons of the Christian sites. The Russians not only took offense at this, but they threatened war and they went to war. So we have what we call the Crim War. It was fought in the Crimea, but the issue was in Jerusalem. Russia on one side, the Ottoman Empire supported by England and France on the other side. Believe you me, the Ottoman Empire did not have the forces to battle the Russians, especially in the Balkans. They depended heavily on the French and the British. The British especially, but also the French, had a long-standing interest in increasing their influence in the Holy Land. This is Christian theology, the Second Coming, and all this connected with it. But tachlis is they were interested in being present. The British put heavy pressure on the Sultan to remove many of the restrictions against non-Muslim communities. And in fact, the Sultan issued a firman in 1856 during the war, removing discriminations against non-Muslims, and for our purposes, even though this was only a side issue for him, opening the Temple Mount to non-Muslims officially. When the war ended in 1856, in the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, the British insisted that this permission that the Sultan gave be part of the peace treaty, and it appears in paragraph 6 of the peace treaty. From then on in, the Temple Mount was open to non-Muslims, meaning Christians and Jews, 6 days a week, every week of the year, from Saturday to Thursday. Friday was reserved for the Muslims. That was British policy, that was French policy. Great victory. A decade later, the Treaty of Paris, another arrangement trying to show up the Ottoman Empire, and again, the decree of the Sultan that the Temple Mount is open to everyone appears in the Treaty of Berlin. Fine. Fast forward to 1914, beginning of the First World War. Understandably, the world of 1914 is quite different than the world of 1856. New elements come into consideration. In November of 1914, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire in those days, enters a war on the side of Germany. And the Sultan issues a call for jihad against the Allies. These were his former partners, remember, 80 years ago. Now he is calling for jihad against England and France, etc. How do the British respond to this? They, of course, want the support of anyone who will oppose the Ottoman Empire. And who are the natural opponents in terms of the British thought? The various Arab nations, or not nations, Arab tribes, let's say. And in one way or another, the British tried to persuade Arab power kegs to join in a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire.
Against the Arabs, the Muslims.
Now, to persuade them even more, you have to offer them something. You have to dangle a reward. And the reward is a twofold one. You will have a kingdom, sovereignty over the land where you live in, and the Arab holy places, the Muslim holy places, we guarantee will be administered 100% by Muslims, not by Christians, not by Turks, by Arab Muslims. At this point, we don't specify what we mean by Arab holy places. That comes later in the story. The English set up a special committee to determine the war goals that the Allies want to achieve in its war against the Ottoman Empire, the De Bunsen Committee. De Bunsen was the chairman of this committee. It was an interdepartmental committee, and they met in 1915, it must have been, for 5 months. At the end of this, they issued a report that was secret for 50 years. Means until 1965, nobody knew what they recommended. But it seems very clear in hindsight that many of the problems that the British developed for themselves by making contradictory promises to the French, to the Arabs, to the Zionists, with conflicting content, are a result of the recommendations of this De Bunsen Committee. Each agreement by itself is beautiful because it furthered the main goal of the British, which was to win the war. We promised the French that we will take the area that we call Palestine and we divide it. Or in another version, we'll administer it together. We promised the Arabs, you will have kingdoms all over the place. And contradictory promises to different Arab kings or proto-kings. Promise to the Zionists a Jewish homeland in Palestine, whatever that means. Okay. (1917) rather. The war is not going well. There have been a series of catastrophic setbacks for the Allies, starting on the Italian front, rather starting on the French front, the Battle of the Somme in the end of 1916, 50,000 plus British casualties, dead. In terms of the total population, this was a tremendous blow to Great Britain. On the Italian front, major defeat. On the Russian front, the Russian Revolution and armistice with Germany. It looked very bleak for the Allies. And there were generals on the high command that actually questioned whether the Allies could win the war. The political echelon felt very strong. Yes, we can. We will. And the policy was led by the political echelon, not by the armies. Another sign you shouldn't rely on the army generals. All due respect. Why is this crucial? Because one of the decisions of the War Cabinet was we ought to intensify the war in the Middle East. We may have a problem right now on the Western Front, but if we push in the Middle East, we can maybe achieve something. General Allenby, the commanding general of the British Army in Egypt, gets orders. changed from being defensive to go on the offense and capture Jerusalem by Christmas time. This was early in 1917. Unheard of. Accepted the orders, marched across the Suez, got as far as Hebron, as far as Beersheba, captured Beersheba. We're now already in September of 1917. Christmas time is around the corner. How is he going to get up to Jerusalem? He continues, and lo and behold, early in December 1917, the Arabs surrender Jerusalem. It's a big story how they surrendered. But Allenby marches into Jerusalem on December 12th, 1917, gets to Jaffa Gate, gets off his horse, and goes in on foot. A historic event. This is the first time in 700 years that a Christian general occupies Jerusalem since the Crusades. The population actually wonders what's going to happen to us in Jerusalem. What will this new general, this Christian general, do to Jerusalem? He gets up on the platform at what we now call Migdal David, Tower of David. Then it was called Herod's Tower, and gives a speech. We have come as conquerors. You're now under military government. But one thing I assure you, we will maintain the status quo, and everybody will continue to worship at their holy places, and all the arrangements that have been in place until now will be continued. Everybody felt relieved. He was in the old city less than an hour. He got back to his temporary military headquarters and communicated to London, to the War Cabinet. In effect, he said something, I followed your instructions, and these are the arrangements I made. And I want to read you in specifically what he cabled to London. The Mosque of Omar, Temple Mount we call it today, and the area around it have been placed under Muslim control in a military cordon of Mohammedan officers and soldiers, meaning Indian Muslims, has been established around the mosque. Orders have been issued that no non-Muslim is to pass within the cordon without permission of the military governor or the Muslim in charge. End quote. Status quo. The status quo was that the Temple Mount was open to everybody. And here he issues an order that from now on in, this is no longer the case. On the one hand, all hell breaks out in London because their interest in London, especially church interests that want to keep the foothold that they have in Jerusalem. But on the other hand, more significant, he followed orders. He didn't invent this. The War Cabinet, 3 weeks before he captured Jerusalem, had a long discussion about the future of Muslim holy places, and specifically the Temple Mount. What are we going to do about this? We have obligations to the Arabs. We have obligations to the Christian churches. We have perhaps obligation to the Jews. What are we going to do about it? They had a long discussion. And the end result of this discussion was the Temple Mount and all other Muslim holy places will be under exclusive control of Muslims. It's exactly as Allenby wrote. Change of mind. Change of mind because of the exigencies of the war. Okay. The English churches did not take this lying down. They applied pressure on the War Cabinet, and the War Cabinet 3 months later rescinded its decision and ordered General Allenby to lift the blockade. The Temple Mount again is open to non-Muslims, except there's a postscript that was not published. The administration of the Temple Mount remains exclusively in the hands of the Muslim authorities. We'll skip 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The military government follows as much as it can the existing procedures. One of the procedures that the Ottomans used quite successfully is to fill local government positions by depending on prominent families. Yerushalayim had 2 prominent families, the Husseinis, and I've got the name of the other one, not important. Okay. And appointments were made from these 2 families. The first mayor of Jerusalem was a Husseini. He was known as an Arab nationalist, but he kept his mouth closed for a little while. And he got along. Came 1920, the Nebi Musa riots, and he was one of the main instigators of the riots, and he got canned from being mayor of Jerusalem. He had a cousin, whom we shall meet again, we met already earlier, who became Mufti of Jerusalem, Mufti of Palestine afterwards, Amin al-Husseini, who was also involved in the Nebi Musa riots. He ran away to Jordan. He was judged by a military tribunal to 10 years of imprisonment. And the story will continue in just a moment. The military government comes to a close because it can't handle the situation. London decides to have a civilian government. Before the mandate is authorized by the League of Nations, before the mandate officially starts in 1923. In 1920, Herbert Samuel is sent from London as the first High Commissioner of Palestine, civilian High Commissioner. One of the first jobs he becomes involved in is to fill the position of Mufti of Jerusalem. According to the Ottoman precedent, the Mufti gets appointed by the governor of Jerusalem, and the High Commissioner has inherited the obligations and privileges of the governor of Jerusalem, so it's his job to appoint the Mufti. He, in consultation with the various chief officers of the new government, decide the ideal person is Amin al-Husseini, still a criminal, running away in Transjordan. So the first thing they do is they commute his sentence. Bring him over. There's an involved procedure where a committee of notables selects the candidate or three candidates, a top list of three candidates, and from that the governor or the high commissioner in our case selects the new mufti. In this case, the assembly considered four candidates, three of them highly qualified. Amin al-Husseini does not meet the qualifications, but he is still in the running, and the final results are something like 19, 17, 15, and 9. Husseini gets 9 votes, so he's not on the short list of 3. Herbert Samuel fixes that problem by offering a plum job to the top contender, who accepts the plum job, and we have now a short list of 3 names, including al-Husseini. And Samuel decides, in consultation with all others, he is the ideal man from our point of view. Never mind, there's a secret British intelligence report that labels him as an enemy of Britain, but that's ignored. They figure this is a young, inexperienced man, we can handle him. Oh, were they wrong. And there was a report in one of the newspapers a couple of years ago, the granddaughter of Herbert Samuel recalled that her grandfather, great-grandfather maybe, told her the one thing he regretted about his service as High Commissioner was that he appointed al-Husseini as Mufti. Anyhow, he gets appointed as Mufti. A little later, he gets appointed as President of the Supreme Muslim Council, which was another invention of the British to handle the Arab problem that backfired. He gets an office in downtown Jerusalem in a government building. And I can't figure out whether it's a week later or 10 days later, he relocates the office from downtown Jerusalem to up on the Temple Mount. And the British don't respond to this, as if it never happened. Condone it. Why? They're concerned about any Arab repercussions, Muslim repercussions from other lands, and especially from India. You have to remember, British India was overwhelmingly Muslim. British India was the crown jewel in the British Empire. So this played heavily in their thoughts. Anyhow, he is up there. And he becomes, in his own eyes, the one who calls the tune on Har HaBayit. He decides now who can go on and who cannot go on. In 1925, Lord Balfour Declaration, now Lord President of the Privy Council, top person in the British hierarchy, comes on a visit to Palestine, and Husseini decides, persona non grata, we will not allow him on the Temple Mount. They blockade all the gates of the Temple Mount, and the British do not do a thing to open them. Balfour did not go on the Temple Mount because Husseini decided, yet. The Shaw Commission that met in 1929 to investigate the riots of 29 heard testimony from many people, including Husseini, and Husseini said, quote, I decide who goes on the Temple Mount, not the British. And nobody contradicted him. In effect, the British lost control of the Temple Mount. They were sovereigns in the country, but not on the Temple Mount. How did this happen? Why? What went on in the British minds? We're talking about the 20s. And I suggest there are 5 ways that we can understand this, that we have to think about at least. One is they were saddled with conflicting commitments from the days of the First World War. They had to juggle the promises made to the Arabs, the promises made to the Jews. The French they ignored by this time already. They were no longer that important. 2, there was a built-in anti-Semitism and pro-Arabism in the British administration, many of whom came from Egypt, many of whom felt very comfortable with the Arabs and the Arab way of life, and just couldn't understand the Eastern European Jews that dominated the new Yishuv. They didn't speak their language. So there may have been some active anti-Semitism. There was active anti-Semitism, but more the pro-Arabism seemed to influence them. And I can cite examples after example. For example, in 1918 already, Pesach 1918, the military government issued a prohibition for Jewish soldiers of the Jewish Legion to come to Jerusalem. Why? You can think of all kinds of reasons, but the commanding general, a non-Jew, the commanding general of the Jewish Legion, was sure that it was anti-Semitism. He said, I cannot understand how Jewish soldiers for the first time in their lives in Palestine are barred from the Temple Wall of Jerusalem during Passover. Anyhow, 3, the problem of keeping internal security in Palestine was overwhelming, way beyond the capacity of the British to handle. 4, the Zionist position on Har HaBayit. The Zionist leadership decided quite early to waive any claim for the Temple Mount, since they were aware that this site might become a flashpoint between them and the Muslims. This was made explicit in 1919, both in Paris at the beginning peace conferences, in visits that Weizmann had with Arab kings throughout. The new Yishuv was not interested what's happening in Jerusalem. Weizmann wrote later on in 1925 to his wife, I've moved the temple from the Temple Mount to the next mountain, Mount Moriah, where I established Hebrew University. This, to him, was the new temple. This made life easier for the British. If the Zionists don't want the Temple Mount, we can give it to the Arabs. What do we have to worry about it? But the final point again, and perhaps the most crucial point, is India. India is a means to preserve the British Empire. The whole purpose of the Suez Canal was to keep the line open to India. Palestine served as a reserve way to get to India if anything happens to the canal. India was so crucial for the British Empire from an economic point of view. By 1913, 60% of British exports went to India. a vast majority of the raw materials that Great Britain needed for its manufacturing activities came from India. The British Army depended on recruits from India, and once slavery was abolished in the British Empire, indentured servants from India filled the gap. So, from all these points of view, India was crucial, and if India is overwhelmingly Muslim, this means something to us decision makers. Summary. Scholars may argue what influenced decision makers as they did, and there are various approaches, but there's no argument about the consequences of the British decision regarding the Temple Mount in the early years of the Mandate. In the short run, these decisions resulted in losing control of the Temple Mount. In the long run, the decisions contributed to British being forced to leave Palestine. And just one additional thought as a supplement to what we heard from the previous speaker. The incident of Amin al-Husseini in 1936 escaping from the British. Where did he flee to first? He fled to the Temple Mount, and he stayed there for a couple of weeks, and the British did not dare to enter the Temple Mount to take him. He escaped by disguising as a woman and ran to Beirut, and then he made the biggest mistake in his life by getting together with Hitler. But the Temple Mount was lost to the British by inaction. Thank you very much.